I'm going to welcome everybody to our third webinar of the year, where Professor Graham Moore has kindly agreed to speak to us about the MRC guidance for complex interventions and process evaluations. This is actually one of a two-part series, and the second part is actually going to be in person, which we're really excited about. So Graham's going to do the introduction today, and hopefully many of you will be able to join us next week at our in-person event. So Graham is a professor in the School of Social Sciences and has a range of roles across the Health and Care Research Wales infrastructure, in DECIPHer and in the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health. But importantly, Graham has led the development and the authorship of the Medical Research Council guidance for process evaluation, and was one of the lead authors on the guidance for adapting interventions to new contexts. So we're really excited to have Graham here with us because he is a UK leader in this topic. But he's also a senior research leader in Health and Care Research Wales.
So thanks for the introduction, Monica. I'm going to give an overview of MRC guidance for developing and evaluating complex interventions, including the sort of broader family of guidance, but focusing in particular on the process evaluation guidance, which, as Monica mentioned, was one of the ones that I led. So I'll cover the evolution of overarching MRC guidance for complex interventions from the first iteration in 2000 to the most recent guidance that was published in 2021. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of 20-odd years of guidance development. I'll also talk about some more sort of specific MRC guidance around process evaluation, and then some guidance which we aren't allowed to officially call MRC guidance, because rather than being commissioned by the MRC, it was researcher-led, but which nevertheless kind of connects to the sort of family of official MRC guidance. And in lots of cases, actually, that official guidance just kind of signposts to those other non-MRC guidances rather than providing new guidance. So I'll talk about the role of some of the work in Wales in shaping this guidance and offer some kind of reflections on kind of where next and possible future directions. I first came to Wales myself as a research assistant in 2004, working on the evaluation of the Welsh Government's Free School Breakfast Initiative, which was a very large cluster randomised trial across about 110 schools in Wales. And the kind of main framework that was in use when I first came into kind of academic evaluation research was this one. It was quite a linear framework, which largely kind of reflected models for developing and evaluating and scaling up pharmaceuticals, moving through phases from kind of theory to modelling to feasibility testing, effect estimation, and then sort of wider implementation. And at this time, it was squarely focused on randomised controlled trials rather than wider evaluation methods beyond this. And it defined complex interventions essentially as those with lots of bits, with multiple components that interact to produce change. And this framework was very widely used and widely cited. Many people found it very useful. Oh, my slides have got a life of their own and moving on too fast. But it also triggered a lot of criticism and new thinking about kind of how to do complex intervention science, which in a way I think is the point of guidance. It's not always about presenting a definitive solution. It presents kind of frameworks and good practice as we currently understand it, but also acts as a catalyst for debate and innovation, which then informs kind of future updates. So in 2008, the MRC published updated guidance led by Peter Craig and colleagues, and this differed from the 2000 guidance in a number of ways. Rather than the kind of linear set of stages we saw before, it provides a more kind of cyclical and iterative framework, and there'll often be a lot of rotation back and forth between phases rather than straightforward movement from one phase to the next. It moved away from a sole focus on randomised trials towards recognising that many really important interventions that affect people's health can't be evaluated via RCTs, and so other methods are often needed. And within this framework, implementation isn't kind of seen as the end of the process. It's not the end of the story, because actually scaled up interventions then become the context in which new interventions are developed. So widely implemented interventions just become the backdrop for the development of new things. And we know from kind of the social policy literature, for example, the policymakers spend most of their time incrementally changing existing policies and augmenting them with slightly new things, rather than writing radical new legislation in a vacuum. And similarly for social interventions, these often tend to be quite incremental departures from what's already there. Really radical new interventions are probably a bit more rare. It also signalled a need to move away from just focusing on aggregate effectiveness. Did this intervention work? Did it do more good than harm? Towards understanding change processes via process evaluation. And the DECIPHer Centre that Monica mentioned, that I'm currently Deputy Director of, was first set up in 2009 when I was a PhD student, funded by UKCRC as one of 5 new centres for excellence in public health research. And the centre is now funded by Health and Care Research Wales. But as the original name of the centre implies, it was very heavily influenced initially and informed by the 2008 MRC framework. And our earliest kind of leaders would have described DECIPHer as kind of followers of the MRC guidance. And our short course teaching was largely kind of framed around teaching how to use the MRC framework. But I think over time, as personnel and kind of leadership changed and as time passed, we did move away from being kind of followers of the guidance. I'll come back to that, what I mean by that later, toward being slightly more critical users of it. But kind of going back to the 2008 guidance for a moment, there are 2 major shifts in thinking which triggered the funding of 2 discrete new sets of guidance. So the 2008 guidance recognised that RCTs are still the most suitable method for evaluating the effects of lots of interventions. But there are also lots of interventions for which this just can't be done. And it's important that we evaluate all kinds of interventions, not just those which can fit within an RCT framework. So the greatest kind of public health achievement of the 21st century, according to the Royal Society for Public Health, for example, was smoke-free workplaces legislation. And I'm not sure how you go about evaluating that via an RCT. So new guidance followed from the MRC, again, led by Peter Craig, on natural experiments. I won't talk about that in much detail because that's actually currently being rewritten. But another major shift was recognition that for evidence to be useful, beyond just a kind of stop-go assessment of whether this intervention is working and should continue in the place where it is, we need to go beyond kind of understanding effect sizes and towards understanding how interventions work, for whom, in what contexts. We need to understand more about process. So 2008 guidance set out 3 broad goals for process evaluation, stating that process evaluation nested within a trial or other outcomes evaluation design. And that insertion is kind of my emphasis, because this guidance, even though it tried to move away from focusing purely on trials, did often still slip back into a language about talking about all evaluations as if they were trials. But process evaluation nested within an outcomes evaluation can be used to assess fidelity and quality of implementation, clarify causal mechanisms, and understand contextual factors. And each iteration of the MRC guidance to date has tried to really deepen emphasis on these core issues. So the MRC commissioned new guidance for process evaluation. And I'll talk about these kind of core aims: implementation, causal mechanisms, and context in turn now, before moving on to the development of that guidance. But first of all, the guidance, it signalled this need to better understand implementation. I think there's often a lot of confusion in how the term implementation is used in the literature, because literally it just means putting a plan into place. And some reserve it specifically for talking about efforts to embed evidence in practice once things have been evaluated. Others use it to describe intervention delivery, whatever stage that occurs at. And the MRC guidance kind of actually tends to use it in both ways, talking about implementation as a discrete phase, but also emphasising the importance of understanding implementation issues throughout. And there are lots of reasons why this is important. So most complex social interventions tend to be based around interactions amongst human participants and implementers. And these will tend to change shape from one time and place to another to an extent. And it's very difficult and often undesirable to fully standardise the kinds of human interactions that form complex interventions. So it can often that can mean that it's often very difficult to describe exactly what the intervention is in terms of the kind of functions that need to be maintained, while kind of practitioners use their sort of knowledge, skills, and experience to tailor interventions to their context and populations. I think historically, though, where people have talked about understanding implementation, there's often been this assumption that this is important because if implementers change an intervention, they're making it worse and somehow undermining fidelity. And that this leads to what's sometimes called a type 3 error, where we conclude that interventions don't work because they were poorly implemented. We throw away potentially good ideas because of poor implementation. But I think sometimes that's a bit unfair on people who implement interventions. And sometimes the opposite is the case. Sometimes skilled local practitioners might be tailoring intervention manuals in ways to ensure they fit their context, that they're made more sustainable and suitable to their populations. And actually, it's that kind of tailoring which is sometimes what makes what might be based on the manual a relatively half-baked intervention turns it into something really effective. So I think without understanding implementation, there's often a risk both of dismissing good ideas that were poorly implemented, but also of attributing success to a manualized description of something which wasn't actually a reflection of what was delivered, and ignoring the role of local implementers in interpreting and translating those. And the guidance also emphasises the importance of understanding not just if interventions work, but kind of how they work in terms of their mechanisms. And this isn't completely uncontroversial. And there was a response to the latest MRC guidance published straight away, which kind of argued quite strongly that we should separate out the goals of evaluation from those of explanation. I'm not entirely sure that's helpful. I think that understanding not just whether, but also how interventions work is often useful for quite a few reasons. So for kind of complex multi-component interventions, in some cases, we might find that there are redundant components and the intervention might not have to be replicated in full elsewhere in order to work. So understanding mechanisms can help with making decisions around kind of streamlining without undermining the effectiveness of the intervention. Understanding mechanisms can also just be important in sort of building theory, understanding what kind of mechanisms other similar interventions might target, perhaps via different contextually suitable methods to produce changes elsewhere. I think understanding context, and we'll obviously come to the mechanisms, and we'll come to this next week when we talk about adaptation, is also important in understanding what exactly it is that you're trying to translate from one context to another, where you are trying to transfer interventions elsewhere. I think sometimes we see intervention transfer fail and people assume it's because the contexts are different, but sometimes it's just because what's been reproduced is only the kind of surface features of an intervention rather than kind of its deeper sort of functions and mechanisms. Each iteration of the MRC guidance, right through the 3 versions so far, has put much more emphasis on the importance of understanding context. I think it's completely uncontroversial that context matters for whether interventions can be implemented or whether how they work. But it's such a nebulous and difficult to define concept or set of concepts that people have often, I think, just ignored it because it's just too hard to get your head around. But I think tools are starting to emerge for kind of classifying and categorizing context in slightly more meaningful ways. But interventions never occur in a vacuum. They do, as I mentioned earlier, tend to often build incrementally on what was already there. And we often see interventions fail to transfer from one place to another just because in the new context, they're not that different to what was already there. And context will often shape kind of what interventions are acceptable, what's possible in terms of implementation, including via kind of things like available resources, local norms. And it also shapes whether interventions work. So context isn't just a backdrop or a set of confounders. Interventions can work by introducing mechanisms which are sufficiently suited to their context to bring about change. So as I mentioned earlier, early guidance kind of focused on complexity as a characteristic of an intervention. So an intervention that had lots of components which interact with each other is a complex intervention. I think more recent definitions, as we've kind of moved through the iterations of the MRC guidance, have shifted towards recognizing that a lot of complexity resides in the context in which new interventions are implemented. So however complex your intervention looks, its complexity probably kind of pales in comparison to what's already going on in the systems where it's being introduced. So MRC guidance, I think, has increasingly recognised that complexity is a characteristic not just of the intervention components, but also its interaction with context. I guess the question I always have about this is whether this actually kind of potentially renders the term complex intervention a bit meaningless, because once we consider all those various sources of complexity, really there are no simple interventions anymore. So perhaps all interventions are complex, but some are more complex than others. My PhD in Wales was a process evaluation of the National Exercise Referral Scheme, and after completing that, I presented it at an early career MRC meeting, and Janice Baird, who's a professor in the MRC unit in Southampton, was there and kind of came to see me afterwards, saying that she was kind of speaking with the MRC about commissioning new guidance for process evaluation, and she was quite insistent that I should be the person to lead its development. I think at the time I was just out of my PhD. I was quite worried about taking on something that I knew would be quite high profile in many ways, worried that kind of if I made a bit of a mess of it, it would end my career as everyone would know about it. But Janice persuaded me to take it on. So we published this in 2015, and it's been widely used. It's been cited about 4,500 times. Lots of funders like NIHR signpost applicants to it where they're undertaking evaluation. So I think in many ways for me, kind of taking that risk did kind of help with kind of moving my career forward and getting my name really known in the field. And I think it has been taken up in lots of countries across the world. I mean, not everyone loved it. We had a very savage reviewer too, who wrote a 4,000 word peer review, complete with 40 references and the occasional Alice in Wonderland quote for no obvious purpose. But for the most part, I think it's been fairly well received. So our framework kind of positioned process evaluation as focusing on everything that happens in between the intervention manual and the outcomes of the intervention. So focusing on how an intervention plan is actually put into place, how it's actually implemented, what mechanisms that new implementation gives rise to, and the role of context kind of throughout, the role of context in shaping what interventions are selected in the first place, how those interventions are implemented, and what mechanisms that new intervention gives rise to. The process evaluation guidance was the last piece of official guidance until the new 2021 guidance that I'll come to in a minute. But the years in between those two things saw a growth in funding of researcher-led guidance by the MRC NIHR Methodology Research Programme, which I think is now called Better Methods, Better Research, or something along those lines. So the first of these was specific guidance for developing interventions. So for that first phase of the MRC guidance, and this is led by Alicia O'Cahoon in Sheffield University, who'd been a really helpful colleague of mine on the process evaluation guidance. And this was published in BMJ Open in 2019. It sets out a model and set of kind of considerations when developing any new intervention. While officially this isn't MRC guidance because it's researcher-led, the new MRC guidance that I'll come to in a minute, published in 2021, signposts researchers to this rather than providing much new guidance on how to do intervention development. So it kind of becomes de facto MRC guidance by virtue of that, I guess. I think this was a slightly more well-resourced guidance development process than the process evaluation guidance had been, where like the only resource was kind of half of my time as an early career researcher for 18 months, plus travel to London for quarterly author group meetings. The index team have published a series of kind of systematic reviews, qualitative work, and Delphi processes that kind of underpin the development of their guidance. And the same committee who funded Index also funded the guest study, which and actually there was no overlap between the Index and guest studies. It was coincidence that they both went into the committee, each focusing on kind of phases of the MRC framework at the same time. So I think when the committee funded these two, the two teams were asked to work together to avoid overlap and duplication. And this was led by Lawrence Moore, who was the founding director of DECIPHer, but had since moved to the Glasgow unit to lead the MRC unit up there. And our role here in Cardiff centred on the first work package, kind of reviewing the literature for existing guidance on feasibility studies and how that guidance was used, which we finished, completed and published in 2018. I mean, there's a lot I could say on this, but I'll keep it brief. But this was one of the most frustrating projects of my career in many ways, because the work was to date hasn't been completed. And I think this was partly in the meantime, because in the meantime, the team had been commissioned to lead the overarching MRC guidance, which was a slightly more kind of high profile piece of work. But I think I was quite frustrated about this because early career colleagues of mine have put a lot of work into the early phases of this, and it's actually not kind of led to guidance as yet. But I won't talk too much more about that. But there is still something of a kind of black hole here which needs revisiting, because the guidance that was published by the MRC in 2021 refers to kind of forthcoming guidance on feasibility studies, but as of yet, this hasn't come forth. Anyway, the next piece of researcher-led work that was funded by the MRC and IHR committee, and I'll cover this very briefly as we're talking about this next week, was guidance for adapting interventions to new contexts. And I mean, as evidence accumulates for how to improve outcomes through interventions, we recognise that it's not always sufficient to develop new interventions. I think historically the MRC guidance has very much been framed around kind of researcher-led processes where researchers develop kind of new interventions from scratch and move through the phases. But actually, in many cases, people take an intervention from elsewhere, bring it to a new context. And often we're using interventions with an evidence base of differing degrees, differing qualities from elsewhere. So there are lots of kind of outstanding questions, I think, that weren't really touched on in the MRC guidance around how you kind of make decisions on when you're taking an intervention from elsewhere and bringing it to a new context, whether and how they need adapting, do differences between contexts and differences and changes you've had to make reintroduce so much uncertainty you need to fully reevaluate them. So this was led from DECIPHer by myself and Rhiannon Evans, who is herself a former Health and Care Research Wales fellowship holder. I think she held a social care fellowship, and her research is very much on the interface between public health and social care. When this was funded, we'd anticipated the guidance kind of building on the new updated MRC guidance, which was due to be published in 2019, but that was delayed by about 2 years. So actually the ADAPT guidance ended up being published slightly ahead of it. We had a really great team on this across 6 universities, including the leads of the index study, to ensure they complemented one another. And I think our 8th and final paper from this was published a few months ago, and the guidance is being used in a range of kind of international projects that we're involved in at the moment. And I'll talk about some of those in a bit more detail next week. I mentioned that DECIPHer started out in 2009 as kind of followers of the MRC guidance, but I think over time became kind of slightly more critical users of it. And I think one of our scientific advisory boards, we were encouraged to kind of publish more reflection pieces focused on our work and what those mean for sort of future guidance, which was something we started to do quite a bit more over the course of the last 5-6 years or so, focusing on issues such as kind of what does it actually mean to base an intervention on theory? What does all the rhetoric we hear about kind of complex systems perspectives actually mean for what people do in practice? And I mean, as you might be able to tell, I sometimes have a bit of a tendency to slightly overthink things, and some of these papers kind of just became quite good outlets for any kind of useful aspects of that overthinking. And they can often be quite hard to find time and headspace to write, but actually these kind of methodological reflective pieces often get quite a lot of attention and can be quite useful for getting your name known, just because methods do apply to everyone, regardless of what your substantive areas are. And I think actually of my 10 most cited papers, probably only 2 or 3 of them actually include any empirical data. Most of my most cited papers are kind of guidance papers or kind of critical reflection pieces. So the 2008 guidance, when it was published, called itself the new MRC guidance. And I mean, I'd advise against using the word new in the title of a paper because it ages quite badly. So in 2021, we have the new guidance. Perhaps in 2030, we'll have new guidance. As I mentioned, I sometimes slightly overthink things. But at the kind of heart of this framework is a model that looks very similar to the 2008 model. There's no longer any kind of sequential ordering between phases. There's more emphasis now on potentially identifying existing interventions or adapting interventions which have an evidence base from elsewhere, rather than kind of just starting every phase, every kind of cycle with developing a new intervention. And the guidance kind of hinges around a series of kind of key considerations for all research phases. So whether you're developing an intervention, conducting a feasibility study, undertaking a full-scale evaluation, all of those phases we need to be thinking about kind of context, program theory, stakeholder engagement, focusing on kind of key uncertainties, viewing intervention refinement as a kind of continuous process, and thinking about kind of economic considerations. And in many cases, rather than kind of providing new guidance, what this updated kind of framework did was to kind of bring together lots of the work that had happened in the 13 years since the previous guidance and kind of signposting back to other sources. So as I mentioned earlier, for intervention development, it largely kind of signposts readers back to index for detailed guidance. For process evaluation, it signposts people back to the process evaluation guidance for kind of detailed recommendations of kind of how to do process evaluation. I think one kind of big shift we've seen in this guidance, though, quite a large kind of methodological or philosophical shift, is I mentioned earlier that each iteration of MRC guidance placed more emphasis on understanding intervention mechanisms and more emphasis on kind of contextual considerations. And the 2000 guidance very much focused on outcomes as being kind of the only the most important thing to capture. And it didn't really do much beyond that. The 2008 guidance moved towards recognizing the importance of process evaluation, the importance of understanding change processes, but that still remained largely subservient to kind of estimates of whether an intervention worked. I think new guidance has moved further towards kind of pluralism, kind of arguing that there is a role for evaluation research which focuses on kind of any or all of efficacy, effectiveness, theory-based questions, or kind of complex systems-based questions, or kind of combinations of all of those. And I think this tries to recognize that for some interventions, kind of effectiveness isn't the biggest unknown. So if you've got lots of evidence, for example, that something works if implemented really well, but there's also lots of evidence that it doesn't tend to be implemented that well, and evaluation approaches which focus on how interventions are kind of integrated into complex systems might become the main focus. I think this pluralism is helpful in lots of ways, but does kind of pose lots of challenges, including for research funding committees. So I'm coming to the end of quite long term on the NIHR Public Health Research Funding Committee, currently as Deputy Chair. And I think we've seen a real evolution in the kinds of studies that committee funds since I joined back in 2016. So when I started on the committee, it used to be almost entirely randomized controlled trials that were funded, with the very occasional kind of natural experimental evaluation. There's now a much greater range of types of evaluation funded. And I think committees are often very good at judging the quality of a randomized controlled trial, where there are quite well-defined standards for what these should or shouldn't do, but judging whether kind of other forms of evaluation are kind of robust can be quite challenging. And we often end up, I find, having much longer and much more polarized discussions around the merits of kind of less traditionally funded evaluation approaches. So I'm nearly finished now, but I just wanted to give a couple of reflections really on kind of where next. And one issue I think with much of this family of guidance is that it's been very health-centric and very UK-centric, with often quite narrow author groups. I think partly that can be because of where the funding's come from, and the funding streams that have kind of covered some of this work have tended to be quite reluctant to allow funders to go outside of the UK, for example. So for the ADAPT guidance that I'll talk about more next week, we brought in a kind of sub-team from a university in Munich, and we actually had a really hard time persuading the funder of the merits of doing that. But some of the questions we're kind of wrestling with at the moment are around kind of the usefulness of these guidance documents in kind of global health contexts. And I'll use some examples in the talk next week of where we're kind of looking at using some of these guidance in global contexts. And I know there've been a lot of discussions lately around transferability of kind of MRC guidance to domains such as social care, where many of you I know will be working, whether this suite of guidance can just be kind of lifted and shifted to other domains, or whether the issues faced are so different that almost entirely new guidance is needed. And I guess another thing I've been thinking quite a bit lately, and it probably sounds like a slightly odd thing to say as someone who's spent much of the last 10 years contributing to this kind of body of guidance, but I think there are lots of questions we need to ask about what difference guidance makes. So we can think of guidance as being an intervention or an event within a system which aims to produce better outcomes for patients and the public by helping researchers, funders, and other kind of actors to make better decisions. And I think there's been such a proliferation of guidance recently that there's been little kind of reflection on how it's being used and whether it's achieving this. And like any intervention, guidance can also have unintended side effects. And I often think, for example, that one of the most fully taken on board messages from earlier MRC guidance is that we must test feasibility fully before running a full-scale RCT. And that's really important, but I also think that has sometimes gone a bit too far and has created a bit of an industry in really expensive feasibility studies, which are sometimes kind of testing things that are only of quite marginal uncertainty and which end up just kind of extending the time it takes until evidence can be made available to decision makers. So I think one piece of work I'd like to do at some point in the future is around kind of reviewing how this body of guidance has actually been used and what evidence there is that it's kind of achieving those kind of intended benefits or causing unintended harms. So I do think maybe it's a bit ironic sometimes that we put kind of interventions like these out there into the system and often don't seem to worry too much about what happens next with it kind of as a consequence. So I think there is a lot more work to do in terms of understanding how the existing guidance is being used before kind of layering more and more guidance on top of it. I think on that topic of how guidance is used, I think if a few of us are currently kind of drafting an editorial on the question of kind of what following the guidance actually means. I mentioned that back in 2009 when DECIPHer was set up, lots of people would see themselves as kind of following the MRC guidance. And when I kind of sit on funding committees or review papers, I often see sentences like, we followed the MRC guidance with no further explanation. And in some cases, you see a whole list of different and sometimes conflicting guidance sources being listed as being used, sometimes with kind of little explanation of how they're going to be synthesized. But actually, using guidance isn't a passive process. You can't just follow it. You have to actively interpret it and apply it to your particular intervention in your particular context. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, I mean, guidance has become much more methodologically and philosophically pluralistic, and it's no longer a set of kind of rigidly defined steps to be followed. And I think this pluralism is really helpful in kind of not stifling growth and innovation in what is kind of a relatively young science. But I also think there are risks that this almost opens up the possibility that almost any study could claim to have kind of followed the guidance in one way or another. And so you end up potentially kind of reinforcing existing practice rather than moving ideas forward. So guidance almost becomes like something like a sacred text from which people kind of pick and choose which bits to follow, which can often be just the things that justify what they would have probably done anyway. So I think I would encourage people who are kind of writing funding applications, kind of using any or all of the guidance documents we talked about today to kind of just show your working and be kind of explicit in how guidance has informed your decisions. So don't just say you've used it because you think a funder expects you to. And in some cases, you kind of may not sort of have space to articulate how guidance has shaped your design decisions. And lots of these documents are kind of signposted to by funders like the NIHR, but it's not mandatory to use them if they don't suit the purposes of your study. But if you do, I think you should be as ready to kind of articulate how you've used it as you might for something else, like if you're asked to kind of describe the fine detail of how you've done your statistical analysis, for example. Okay, so just to summarize, UK MRC guidance has kind of over the course of the last 20 years or so moved away from a focus just on whether interventions work towards kind of encouraging deeper attention on kind of how they work and in what contexts. I think the early overarching guidance has kind of acted as a catalyst for a whole series of newer kind of more specific guidance documents, which have then fed into kind of updates to the overarching guidance. I think there are still a lot of questions to answer around kind of how the guidance is used and usefulness beyond kind of UK health research. And I don't imagine that the third iteration of the MRC guidance will be the final one. There's no doubt going to be a version 4 in the next decade or so. And lots of kind of critical reflections on how it is or isn't being used will be vital in kind of shaping what happens next. Just before I finish, just thought I'd mention that we do kind of run some short courses in DECIPHer, and I know email went out to faculty members quite recently that we are kind of piloting, kind of offering some places on these courses to faculty members. So the courses are, the website is here if you want to have a look at any of those.